1845, the most powerful empire on Earth sent two of its finest ships into the Arctic, HMS Erebus, HMS Terror. The expedition carried 129 men, advanced naval technology, and the confidence of a nation that believed it was mapping the last unknown corners of the world. Their mission was clear: find the Northwest Passage and complete one of the final puzzles of global navigation. But the ships never came back. Years later, search expeditions began finding strange fragments of the story. A single note left behind in the Arctic, scattered human remains, abandoned camps, and disturbing clues about the expedition's final months. And then, more than 170 years after the voyage began, the ships themselves were finally discovered beneath the ice. But the discovery did not solve the mystery. If anything, it made the story stranger. Because the more evidence historians uncovered, the clearer one thing became. Something about this expedition did not fit the confident image of the modern world, and Franklin's expedition was not the only place where the modern age seemed to lose its grip on certainty. To understand why the Franklin expedition felt so shocking, and why it still feels unsettling today, we need to step back into the world of the mid-19th century. This was an age of extraordinary confidence. Across Europe and North America, people increasingly believed they were living in a new kind of world. Railways were spreading across continents. Steamships were shrinking oceans. Telegraph lines were beginning to connect cities with almost unimaginable speed. For the first time in history, it seemed possible that the entire planet could be mapped, measured, and understood. And no country embodied that confidence more than Britain. By the 1840s, the British Empire controlled vast territories across the globe. Its navy was the most powerful maritime force in existence. British ships carried goods, soldiers, scientists, and administrators to nearly every corner of the world. Exploration had become more than adventure. It was a matter of national prestige. One of the greatest geographical puzzles that remained unsolved was the Northwest Passage. For centuries, European explorers had searched for a navigable route through the Arctic that would connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. Such a passage would shorten trade routes to Asia and symbolize mastery over one of the harshest environments on Earth. By the early 19th century, dozens of expeditions had tried to chart the maze of islands and ice that stretched across the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Many returned with valuable maps. Some returned barely alive. A few never returned at all. Yet, by the 1840s, technology and planning had improved dramatically. So ships were stronger, navigation was more precise, provisions were better organized. The British Admiralty believed that the final breakthrough might finally be within reach. So in May 1845, two ships sailed from England under the command of Sir John Franklin, a seasoned Arctic explorer and respected naval officer. The ships themselves were symbols of modern ingenuity. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror had originally been bomb vessels, heavily reinforced ships designed to fire large mortars during naval warfare. Their hulls were strong enough to survive extreme stress. For the Arctic mission, they were further modified with iron reinforcements, steam engines, and internal heating systems. Inside their holds were 3 years of provisions. They carried thousands of canned food rations, preserved meat, flour, tea, chocolate, and alcohol. Scientific instruments were packed alongside navigational tools. There were libraries of books, musical instruments, and even equipment for theatrical performances. This was not a desperate gamble. It was meant to be a carefully prepared scientific and naval mission. The expedition included 129 officers and sailors, many of them experienced seamen. Their leader, Sir John Franklin, was already a celebrated figure in British exploration. When the ships departed, the mood in Britain was optimistic. Newspapers reported the voyage with excitement. Admiralty officials expected that the expedition would complete the mapping of the Arctic archipelago and finally solve the centuries-old puzzle of the Northwest Passage. For a while, everything seemed to proceed normally. The ships stopped in Greenland. They took on additional supplies. Letters were sent home. And then, they vanished. No further confirmed communication from Franklin or his crew ever reached Britain again. At first, this did not seem alarming. Arctic expeditions often disappeared from view for long stretches of time. The ice could trap ships for entire seasons, forcing crews to wait through the winter before continuing their journey. But as the years passed with no word from Franklin, anxiety began to grow. By the late 1840s, the British Admiralty faced an uncomfortable question. What if something had gone terribly wrong? Over the next decade, search expeditions began to spread across the Arctic, following fragments of rumor, scattered relics, and occasional clues reported by Inuit communities. What they eventually found was not a clear explanation. Instead, they discovered something far more unsettling. The Franklin expedition had not simply disappeared. It had left behind just enough evidence to suggest a story, but never enough to fully tell it. The first real clue about the fate of Franklin's expedition did not appear immediately. For years, the Arctic remained silent. Ships from Britain searched along the coasts of Greenland, through the channels of the Canadian Arctic archipelago, and across vast stretches of frozen sea. Expeditions were launched by the Admiralty. Private expeditions followed. Even Franklin's wife, Lady Jane Franklin, helped fund additional searches, refusing to accept that the story had simply ended in the ice. Gradually, fragments began to emerge. Not a full explanation, just fragments. The most famous of these fragments was discovered in 1859, when an expedition led by Captain Francis Leopold McClintock reached King William Island, deep inside the Arctic archipelago. There, buried in a small cairn of stones, McClintock's team found a single sheet of paper. Today it is known as the Victory Point Note. It remains the most important document ever recovered from the Franklin expedition. At first glance, the note looked routine. The original message, written in May 1847, suggested that everything had been proceeding normally. It reported that the ships Erebus and Terror had wintered in the ice and that the expedition was continuing its exploration. But then something strange appeared. Along the margins of the same document, a second message had been added nearly a year later. This second note told a very different story. By April 1848, the ships had been trapped in ice for more than 2 years. The crew had abandoned them. And Sir John Franklin himself had already died. The surviving men, 105 of them, were preparing to march south across the frozen landscape toward the Canadian mainland. After that message, there were no more written records, no diary explaining what happened next, no logbook describing the final journey, just a brief announcement of disaster, written in a few hurried lines. And then silence. The discovery of the Victory Point Note solved one mystery, but immediately opened several more. Why had the ships become trapped so completely? Why had the men abandoned vessels that were specifically reinforced for Arctic ice? And perhaps most troubling of all, what had happened during the long final months between the abandonment of the ships and the deaths of the remaining crew? As search expeditions continued exploring the region, more unsettling evidence appeared. Explorers began finding scattered objects along the coast of King William Island. Silver spoons, buttons from naval uniforms, pieces of equipment, and occasionally human bones. Some of these remains suggested that the final journey south had been desperate and chaotic. Groups of men appeared to have collapsed at different points along the route. The landscape was vast, freezing, and unforgiving. But other clues were even more disturbing. Several Inuit accounts collected during later expeditions described encounters with starving Europeans dragging sledges across the ice. Some reports suggested that the men were exhausted and disoriented. Others contained darker claims. A few witnesses described scenes that hinted at extreme desperation among the survivors, accounts that later investigators interpreted as possible evidence of cannibalism during the expedition's final stages. These claims were controversial. Some Victorian explorers dismissed them outright, believing they were exaggerations or misunderstandings. But decades later, forensic analysis of human remains recovered from the region would reveal cut marks on bones consistent with butchering. Even so, the full sequence of events remained unclear. How long did the men survive after abandoning the ships? Why had the expedition become trapped so far from the route that Franklin had originally intended to follow? And what exactly happened to the final survivors? For more than a century, the Franklin expedition remained one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of exploration. Maps improved. Arctic geography became better understood. Later explorers successfully navigated parts of the Northwest Passage, but Franklin's ships themselves remained missing until the 21st century. In 2014, researchers finally located the wreck of HMS Erebus beneath the cold waters of the Canadian Arctic. 2 years later, in 2016, the wreck of HMS Terror was also discovered. The ships were remarkably well preserved. Cabins, instruments, and objects from daily life remained inside the wrecks. For historians and archaeologists, the discoveries were extraordinary. After nearly 170 years, the physical remains of the expedition had finally been found. But the new discoveries produced an unexpected result. They did not close the mystery. Instead, they raised new questions. The wreck of Terror, for example, appeared to have been found far from where earlier searchers expected it to be. Some features suggested that the ship may have drifted or even been navigated after the crew abandoned it, which raised a troubling possibility. If the ship moved, who moved it, and when? Even with modern underwater archaeology, even with advanced scientific analysis, the Franklin expedition still refuses to resolve into a simple story. The expedition left behind evidence, but the evidence forms an incomplete puzzle. A few lines of writing, scattered bones across a frozen landscape, two silent ships resting in dark Arctic water, and a story that feels less like a solved historical event and more like a gap in the record of the modern world. But here is where the story becomes even stranger. Because the Franklin expedition was not the only place in the 19th century where the modern world seemed to lose something important. Around the same time that Arctic explorers were vanishing into ice, another mystery appeared thousands of miles away. This time, in the open ocean. A ship was found drifting across the Atlantic. Its sails were set. Its cargo was intact. Its food and water were still aboard. But every person on the ship had vanished. By the early 1870s, the world of ocean travel had changed dramatically. Steam power was transforming shipping routes. Transatlantic trade had become faster and more reliable than ever before. Ports in Europe and North America were connected by increasingly regular maritime traffic. The Atlantic Ocean, once feared as a vast and unpredictable wilderness, had become something closer to a highway. In theory, ships were safer than they had ever been. But in December of 1872, a strange discovery in the middle of the Atlantic suggested that the modern world was not as orderly as it believed. On December 4th, the British brigantine Dei Gratia was sailing through the Atlantic Ocean, roughly halfway between the Azores and the coast of Portugal. The crew noticed another vessel in the distance. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Ships frequently crossed paths along these trade routes. But as the Dei Gratia drew closer, something about the other vessel looked wrong. Its sails were partly set, yet the ship was drifting irregularly. There were no visible crew members on deck. Concerned, the captain of the Dei Gratia, David Morehouse, ordered a small boarding party to investigate. When they climbed aboard the vessel, they discovered its name painted along the stern: Mary Celeste. The ship had departed New York on November 7th, 1872, bound for Genoa, Italy. On board were Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their young daughter Sophia, and 7 crew members. 10 people in total. But when the boarding party searched the ship, they found something deeply unsettling. There was no sign of anyone. The entire ship was empty. The crew began searching the cabins. The captain's quarters were undisturbed. Personal belongings were still present. Clothing remained folded. Even the crew's pipes and everyday objects were lying where they had last been used. Below deck, the cargo remained intact. The ship was carrying more than 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol, and none of the barrels appeared to have been stolen or damaged. Food and water supplies were still plentiful. The ship's galley showed signs of normal use. The vessel itself was not sinking. It had taken on some water, but nothing close to enough to threaten the ship. In fact, after minor repairs, the Mary Celeste was able to sail again, which left investigators with a deeply uncomfortable question. If the ship was still seaworthy, why had everyone abandoned it? Even more strangely, the ship's lifeboat was missing. This suggested that the captain and crew had left deliberately, but the logbook offered almost no explanation. The last entry had been written 9 days earlier, when the ship was still far from where it had been discovered. Whatever happened during those final days left no written record. The mystery quickly became international news. When the Mary Celeste was brought to Gibraltar, maritime authorities opened an official inquiry to determine what had happened. Theories began to circulate almost immediately. Some investigators suspected mutiny. Others wondered if the crew had attempted insurance fraud. Still others proposed that the cargo of alcohol might have leaked dangerous vapors, possibly causing an explosion scare that forced the crew to temporarily abandon ship. But every theory faced serious problems. There was no evidence of violence, no sign of struggle, no missing cargo, and no clear reason why an experienced captain like Benjamin Briggs would abandon a ship that was still capable of sailing. Over time, explanations multiplied. Perhaps a sudden storm had frightened the crew. Perhaps a navigational error convinced them they were in immediate danger. Perhaps an accident with the cargo created the illusion that the ship might explode. But the truth is that no explanation has ever fully resolved the puzzle. The Mary Celeste remains one of the most famous maritime mysteries in history. A ship discovered drifting across an ocean that had supposedly become predictable and controlled. A vessel fully intact, but without its people. And as strange as the story of the Mary Celeste may seem, it was not the last time the modern world would produce a disappearance like this. Because by the end of the 19th century, another mystery would appear. Not on a ship in the open sea, but on a small rocky island in the North Atlantic. An island where a lighthouse had been built to protect sailors from danger. A place meant to bring light into the darkness. But one winter, in 1900, that lighthouse itself became the center of a mystery. When a supply ship arrived at the island, the lighthouse lamp was dark. The station doors were closed. The clocks had stopped, and the 3 men assigned to keep the light burning were gone. By the end of the 19th century, the sea was no longer the chaotic wilderness it had once been. Across the coasts of Europe and North America, governments had built networks of lighthouses, warning beacons designed to guide ships through dangerous waters. These structures were symbols of order imposed on the ocean, tall towers of stone and iron whose rotating lights cut through darkness and fog. They were meant to eliminate uncertainty. A ship might still face storms or mechanical failure, but a functioning lighthouse meant that sailors would not be left completely alone in the night. In the winter of 1900, one such lighthouse stood on a remote cluster of rocky islands in the Outer Hebrides, off the western coast of Scotland. The islands were known as the Flannan Isles. They were small, windswept, and almost entirely uninhabited. Waves crashed constantly against steep cliffs. The Atlantic winds swept across the rocks with little obstruction. Because of the dangers the islands posed to passing ships, a lighthouse had been built there just a few years earlier. It was a modern installation, solidly constructed, well supplied, and staffed by 3 lighthouse keepers whose job was simple but critical: maintain the lamp, monitor the weather, and ensure the light remained visible to ships passing through the dark waters of the North Atlantic. The 3 men assigned to the station in December of 1900 were James Duckett, the principal keeper, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and Donald MacArthur, a temporary replacement keeper. Their work followed a strict routine. The lamp had to be cleaned and refueled. Its equipment needed to be inspected. Weather observations were logged. Everything about lighthouse life was designed around precision and repetition, which is why the first sign that something had gone wrong appeared so quickly. On December 15th, 1900, a passing ship reported that the lighthouse light was not visible. At first, this was not immediately alarming. Storms could obscure visibility. Mechanical problems could occur. But when the lighthouse remained dark for several days, concern began to grow. Finally, on December 26th, a supply vessel named Hesperus arrived at the island. The crew expected a routine resupply visit. Instead, what they found was deeply unsettling. As the ship approached the landing area, no one came down to greet them. Normally, the lighthouse keepers watched for supply ships and would descend to help guide the landing. This time, the shoreline remained silent. When the crew climbed the steep path up toward the lighthouse, they noticed something else. The flagpole stood empty. No signal flag had been raised to welcome the ship. When they reached the lighthouse buildings, the doors were closed. Inside, the rooms appeared tidy, but strangely abandoned. The oil lamps had been cleaned. The beds were unmade. A half-eaten meal remained on the table, but there were no keepers anywhere. Searches began immediately. The supply crew explored the lighthouse tower, the surrounding buildings, and the nearby cliffs. There was no sign of struggle, no bodies, no clear evidence of what had happened. 3 men had simply disappeared. As investigators from the Northern Lighthouse Board later examined the island, they attempted to reconstruct the final hours of the lighthouse keepers. Some clues suggested that at least 2 of the men may have gone outside during a storm to secure equipment near the landing area. Evidence of damage from powerful waves was found along the rocks. This led to one possible explanation. Perhaps the keepers had been swept away by a sudden surge of water. But that theory raised new questions. Why would all 3 men leave the safety of the lighthouse at the same time? Standard lighthouse procedure required that at least one keeper remain inside at all times. And why had one of the men apparently left behind his heavy coat? The investigation produced a report, but no definitive conclusion. The official explanation suggested that the men had likely been caught by a powerful wave while attempting to secure equipment. But even the investigators acknowledged that the exact sequence of events could not be reconstructed. Over time, the disappearance of the Flannan Isles keepers became surrounded by speculation. Some stories exaggerated the details. Others invented dramatic last entries in the Lighthouse logbook. Entries describing storms, strange fears, or emotional breakdowns among the keepers. Most of these claims were later dismissed as fiction, but the core fact remained. 3 experienced lighthouse keepers had vanished from an isolated island. No clear explanation was ever proven. And the lighthouse itself, a structure built specifically to eliminate danger and uncertainty at sea, had briefly become the center of its own mystery. By the beginning of the 20th century, the modern world seemed to be producing a strange pattern. Explorers vanished into the Arctic. Ships drifted across the Atlantic without crews. Lighthouse stations meant to guard against disaster became silent. And yet the anomalies did not stop at sea. Because the same century that built steamships and lighthouses also witnessed something else. The birth of entirely new technologies. Technologies that promised to capture and preserve reality itself. One of the most important of those technologies was motion pictures. But in 1890, just as one of the earliest pioneers of film stood on the edge of changing history, he disappeared. Not at sea, not in the wilderness, but somewhere between 2 cities in modern Europe. And unlike Franklin's ships or the Flannan Lighthouse, the mystery surrounding his disappearance did not unfold on the edge of the known world. It happened in the middle of the modern one. By the late 19th century, the world was not only expanding geographically, it was also expanding technologically. Steam power, telegraphs, photography, and electrical lighting were transforming everyday life. Cities were becoming brighter, faster, and more connected. Scientific discoveries seemed to arrive one after another. For many people living in this era, it felt as if reality itself was becoming more visible. Photography could capture moments in time. Newspapers could report events across continents. And a new invention was beginning to emerge that promised something even more extraordinary: the ability to capture moving images. Among the pioneers experimenting with this technology was a French inventor named Louis Le Prince. Today, Le Prince is sometimes called one of the forgotten fathers of cinema. Years before motion pictures became a global industry, he had already begun experimenting with cameras capable of recording sequences of moving images. In 1888, he successfully filmed what is widely believed to be one of the earliest surviving motion picture sequences. The short film, later known as Round Hay Garden Scene, shows members of Le Prince's family walking in a garden in Leeds, England. The footage lasts only a few seconds, but those few seconds represent a moment when history was about to change. Le Prince believed he was close to perfecting a motion picture camera that could transform entertainment and communication. He planned to travel to the United States to demonstrate his invention publicly. If successful, he might have become one of the most famous inventors of the modern age. But in September 1890, something strange happened. Le Prince boarded a train in the French city of Dijon, planning to travel to Paris before continuing his journey overseas. He never arrived. When the train reached Paris, Louis Le Prince was gone. His luggage was missing, his equipment was gone, and there was no confirmed witness who could explain where he had disappeared. Investigations followed. Police questioned passengers. Family members searched for clues, but the case quickly stalled. No body was ever found. No definitive explanation was established. Some historians later speculated that Le Prince might have taken his own life. Others wondered if his disappearance could have been connected to patent disputes or rival inventors in the early film industry. There were even suggestions that the disappearance might have been a simple accident that was never properly documented. But none of these explanations has ever been proven conclusively, which leaves an uncomfortable historical possibility. One of the earliest pioneers of cinema, a man who might have changed the story of technological innovation, simply vanished. In a century obsessed with documenting reality. And strangely, the late 19th century produced another anomaly that felt very different, but carried the same unsettling tone. This time, the mystery did not involve a missing person. Instead, it involved a house. In 1884, a woman named Sarah Winchester moved to San Jose, California. She was the widow of William Wirt Winchester, whose family fortune came from the famous Winchester repeating rifle. By the time Sarah arrived in California, she had inherited an enormous fortune. Soon after settling there, construction began on what would become one of the strangest houses in American architectural history. At first, the building appeared normal enough, a large Victorian residence surrounded by orchards. But over the years, the house continued to expand. Rooms were added, hallways were extended, staircases appeared in unexpected places, doors opened into walls. Other doors opened directly into empty space. Windows were installed in interior rooms where no sunlight could reach them. Construction rarely stopped. Carpenters worked year after year, modifying and extending the structure. By the early 20th century, the house had become a sprawling architectural maze. Visitors who walked through its corridors often described the experience as disorienting. Some staircases ended abruptly. Others climbed toward ceilings. Corridors turned unexpectedly. Rooms connected in unusual ways. Over time, stories began circulating about the motivations behind this strange construction. According to a popular legend, Sarah Winchester believed she was haunted by the spirits of people killed by Winchester rifles. The story claimed that a medium had advised her to build continuously in order to confuse or appease the spirits. Whether that explanation is true remains a subject of debate among historians. What is certain is that the house itself became a physical embodiment of uncertainty. A real structure, built over decades, documented by records and photographs, yet surrounded by a cloud of myth and speculation, which raises an interesting possibility. In the late 19th century, mysteries did not only appear in remote Arctic ice or on empty ships drifting across the Atlantic. They also appeared in the middle of cities, in train stations, in houses, in the lives of inventors. Modern systems, railways, patents, architecture, technology were expanding everywhere. But sometimes, within those systems, something slipped out of view. A man vanished. A house grew stranger and stranger, and the explanations that followed were never entirely satisfying. But perhaps the most unsettling anomaly of the entire century did not involve missing ships, missing people, or strange buildings. Instead, it involved something far larger, the sky itself, because in 1883, an event in Southeast Asia would trigger atmospheric effects so unusual that people across the world began describing sunsets that looked almost unreal. Blood-red skies, strange halos around the sun, and nights when the moon appeared blue. By the late 19th century, the modern world was becoming increasingly interconnected. Steamships carried news across oceans. Telegraph cables transmitted messages across continents. Newspapers reported events occurring thousands of miles away within days. For the first time in human history, people in distant parts of the world could share the experience of the same event. But in 1883, that shared experience would not come through technology. It would come through the sky. On August 27, 1883, the volcanic island of Krakatoa located in the Sunda Strait between Java and Sumatra, erupted in one of the most powerful volcanic explosions ever recorded in modern history. The eruption was catastrophic. A series of massive explosions tore apart most of the island. The force of the blasts was so intense that they were heard more than 3,000 miles away, in places as distant as Australia and the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean. The eruption triggered enormous tsunamis, some rising more than 30 meters high, which struck coastal settlements across the Indonesian archipelago. Entire villages were destroyed. More than 36,000 people are believed to have died in the disaster. But the most unusual consequences of Krakatoa did not occur immediately. They unfolded slowly and globally. The eruption blasted enormous quantities of volcanic ash and dust high into the upper atmosphere. These particles spread around the planet, carried by high-altitude winds. Within weeks, observers in many parts of the world began reporting strange changes in the sky. Sunsets grew unusually vivid. Instead of fading gently into darkness, evening skies began to glow in deep reds, oranges, and purples. In some places, the colors lingered for nearly an hour after the sun had already disappeared below the horizon. The phenomenon was so dramatic that people across Europe and North America began writing about it in letters, diaries, and newspaper articles. Artists tried to capture the strange skies on canvas. Scientists debated the cause. Some observers described a faint blue coloration of the moon, a rare atmospheric effect caused by the scattering of light through volcanic particles. Others reported unusual halos around the sun. In London, observers described sunsets that looked like vast sheets of fire stretching across the horizon. In New York, newspapers printed descriptions of evening skies that seemed almost unnatural. At the time, many people did not immediately understand what was happening. Some believed the strange skies were connected to distant storms. Others speculated about unusual solar activity. Only gradually did scientists realize that the effects were connected to the eruption of Krakatoa, thousands of miles away. What made the phenomenon remarkable was its global scale. The eruption had altered the atmosphere of the entire planet. For months after the explosion, people in widely separated regions witnessed similar visual effects in the sky. For many observers living in the 19th century, the experience must have been unsettling. The world they believed they understood suddenly looked different. Sunsets became dramatic and unfamiliar. Night skies glowed in unusual colors. The atmosphere itself seemed transformed. Today, modern science provides a clear explanation. Fine particles of volcanic ash suspended high in the atmosphere scatter sunlight in unusual ways, producing vivid red and purple twilight displays. But for those witnessing the phenomenon at the time, the explanation was far less obvious. What they experienced was something stranger, an entire planet temporarily sharing the same uncanny sky. And when viewed alongside other mysteries of the century, vanished expeditions, ghost ships, silent lighthouses, missing inventors, and houses wrapped in myth, the event adds another layer to the pattern. Because the 19th century was an age of extraordinary confidence in progress. It built railways, telegraphs, steamships, and global communication networks. It believed the world was becoming clearer, more measurable, more understandable. Yet again and again, events appeared that reminded people how fragile that sense of control could be. Sometimes the mystery appeared in frozen Arctic landscapes, sometimes in empty ships drifting across the ocean, sometimes in vanished individuals, and sometimes, unexpectedly, in the sky itself. But the strange experiences of the 19th century were not limited to physical phenomena. They also touched something more elusive: memory, perception, and the uneasy feeling that the past might not always stay where we expect it to remain. Because in 1901, two women visiting the gardens of Versailles would later claim that they had encountered something deeply unsettling. Not a disaster, not a disappearance, but an experience that felt, to them, as if time itself had briefly slipped. By the beginning of the 20th century, the modern world had transformed how people understood reality. Photography could freeze moments in time. Newspapers could report events across continents within days. Scientific institutions were cataloguing natural phenomena with increasing precision. History itself was becoming something that could be documented, archived, and studied systematically. And yet, even in this increasingly ordered world, strange stories still appeared. One of the most unusual emerged in 1901, in one of the most famous historical locations in Europe, Versailles. The former palace of French kings had long since become a monument to the past. Tourists visited its grand halls and gardens to experience the world of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, a world that had vanished during the French Revolution more than a century earlier. Among the visitors that summer were two English women. Charlotte Ann Moberly and Eleanor Jordan were both educated academics. They were not mystics or spiritualists by reputation. Each held respected positions in the British academic world. In August 1901, the two women decided to visit the gardens surrounding the Petit Trianon, a smaller palace within the Versailles estate famously associated with Marie Antoinette. At first, the visit seemed ordinary. The gardens were quiet. The paths wound through trees and lawns much as they had for centuries. But as Moberly and Jourdain later described the experience, something about the atmosphere began to feel strange. They became disoriented while walking along the garden paths. They encountered figures who appeared to be dressed in clothing that seemed oddly outdated. The surroundings, they later wrote, felt strangely still, as if the air itself had become heavy. According to their account, the two women believed they saw people who looked as though they belonged not to the 20th century, but to the 18th. One figure in particular left a strong impression: a woman sitting in the garden, sketching. Years later, Moberly would suggest that this figure resembled Marie Antoinette herself. At the time, however, the women did not immediately interpret the experience as supernatural. They simply felt that something about the scene was deeply unusual. When they returned home and began discussing the details of their experience, the story took on a different character. Certain details of clothing and architecture seemed to match historical descriptions of the Versailles gardens during the late 18th century. The women began to wonder whether they had somehow witnessed a kind of historical replay. Eventually, they decided to publish their account. In 1911, they released a book titled An Adventure, describing what they believed might have been a form of time slip, an encounter with the past, briefly intruding into the present. The story quickly attracted attention. Some readers found it fascinating, others were skeptical. Historians and psychologists offered various explanations. Perhaps the women had misinterpreted ordinary visitors wearing historical costumes. Perhaps they had unknowingly wandered into a private event or historical reenactment. Perhaps their memories had shifted over time as they researched the history of Versailles and began to reinterpret their original experience. It is also possible that the story became gradually embellished as it passed from memory to manuscript. What makes the Trianon experience interesting is not necessarily whether the women truly saw something supernatural. the significance lies elsewhere. Two educated observers experienced something they could not easily explain, and when they tried to reconstruct the event, they found themselves navigating the blurred boundary between history, memory, and interpretation. In a sense, the episode mirrors the other anomalies of the 19th century. The Franklin expedition left behind fragments of evidence that could never fully reconstruct the final story. The Mary Celeste left behind a ship with no witnesses. The Flannan Isles Lighthouse left behind an empty station and unanswered questions. Louis Le Prince disappeared at the edge of a technological revolution. The Winchester House became a real structure wrapped in myth. And Krakatoa transformed the sky in ways that felt uncanny to observers around the world. In each case, something remained incomplete. Evidence existed, but the narrative never quite closed, and that may be the most interesting pattern of all, because the 19th century was supposed to be the age when humanity finally began to understand the world through science, exploration, and documentation. Instead, it may also have been the moment when a new kind of mystery appeared. Not the mysteries of ancient legends or forgotten civilizations, but modern mysteries, events that occurred within systems designed to eliminate uncertainty, yet still produced gaps in the record, which brings us back to the question that has quietly grown larger throughout this story. If the 19th century was the age when the modern world was built, why did it also become the age when so many strange anomalies appeared inside that very world? By the time we reach the early 20th century, the pattern begins to feel difficult to ignore. An Arctic expedition vanishes despite careful preparation. A ship crosses the Atlantic with its crew gone, but its cargo untouched. 3 lighthouse keepers disappear from a remote island without leaving a clear explanation. An inventor on the verge of transforming technology vanishes between 2 cities. A house becomes a maze of architecture and myth. A volcanic eruption alters skies across the planet. 2 educated observers believe they have encountered a fragment of the past in the gardens of Versailles. Each of these events is strange in its own way. But the deeper question is whether they are connected by something larger than coincidence. Historians generally approach such patterns cautiously. It is tempting to imagine hidden forces linking mysterious events together. But history often offers more grounded explanations, explanations rooted in the realities of a rapidly changing world. One possible explanation lies in the limits of 19th century systems. The 19th century is often remembered as the age when modern systems of control first emerged. Governments created national archives. Scientific institutions standardized observation and measurement. Global shipping routes connected continents. Telegraph networks transmitted information across oceans. But these systems were still young. Maps were incomplete. Communication was slow by modern standards. Record-keeping depended heavily on individual observers. Many environments, especially places like the Arctic, remained poorly understood. In other words, the 19th century was an age of expanding systems that had not yet reached their full capacity. Under these conditions, it is not surprising that gaps in knowledge appeared. An expedition could vanish because the environment was still largely unknown. A ship could drift without explanation because maritime communication was limited. A lighthouse accident might leave few clues because isolated stations operated far from immediate oversight. When viewed this way, many of these mysteries may reflect the growing pains of early modern infrastructure, rather than something fundamentally inexplicable. Another explanation focuses on the power of storytelling and myth-making. The 19th century saw an explosion in mass media. Newspapers circulated widely, often publishing dramatic stories that captured public imagination. Serialized journalism, illustrated magazines, and popular pamphlets turned unusual events into widely shared narratives. Once a story entered public consciousness, it often evolved. The Mary Celeste, for example, became the subject of fictional retellings that exaggerated its mystery. The Flannan Isles disappearance inspired poems and folklore. The Winchester House gradually acquired supernatural legends long after its construction had begun. Even the Trianon experience gained a second life through publication and debate. In this sense, some historical mysteries grow not because the original event was inexplicable, but because the story surrounding it continued to expand. Memory, narrative, and speculation filled the spaces where evidence was incomplete. A third explanation may lie in the psychological atmosphere of the 19th century itself. For people living through this period, the pace of change was extraordinary. Industrialization transformed cities. Scientific discoveries reshaped understanding of the natural world. Traditional religious and social structures were increasingly challenged by new ideas. In such an environment, the world could sometimes feel unstable. Familiar landscapes were changing rapidly. Technologies appeared that earlier generations would have considered impossible. Entire ways of life were disappearing. Under these conditions, people often interpreted unusual events through the emotional lens of their time. An unexplained disappearance might seem more ominous. A strange sunset might feel almost apocalyptic. A disorienting experience in a historic garden might acquire deeper symbolic meaning. In other words, the 19th century was not only producing unusual events, it was also producing new ways of interpreting them. And finally, there is another possibility, one that historians often discuss more quietly. Modern systems do not eliminate mystery. Sometimes they simply transform the way mystery appears. Earlier centuries had their own unexplained phenomena: lost civilizations, unexplored continents, mythological creatures. But the 19th century introduced a different kind of uncertainty. Instead of legends emerging from distant, unknown lands, mysteries now appeared inside systems designed to eliminate uncertainty. An expedition vanishes despite scientific preparation. A ship drifts through well-traveled shipping lanes. A lighthouse fails within a carefully managed network. An inventor disappears in the middle of a modern railway system. These are not mysteries at the edge of the known world. They occur inside the very structures meant to make the world predictable. And that may be the most important shift of all. Because when mysteries occur within systems designed to prevent them, they feel more unsettling. They suggest that progress may not eliminate uncertainty as completely as people once hoped. Instead, progress may simply move the boundaries of mystery into new territory. The 19th century did not end uncertainty. It reorganized it, which raises a final question. If these events reflect the limits of early modern systems, what can the historical record actually tell us? How much of these stories comes from solid documentation? And how much comes from the complicated relationship between evidence, interpretation, and memory? To answer that question, historians often turn to the sources themselves: newspapers, official reports, letters, diaries, fragments of testimony scattered across time. Because sometimes the most revealing clues about a historical mystery do not lie in the event itself. They lie in the evidence that survives afterward, and in the surprising ways those pieces of evidence agree or contradict one another. When historians investigate stories like these, the first instinct is often to ask a simple question. What do the records actually say? Not the rumors, not the later retellings, not the dramatic interpretations that appear in novels or films, but the original documents, because in historical mysteries, the most revealing clues often lie in the gap between what happened and what was written down about it. Take the Franklin expedition. For more than a decade after the ships disappeared, the British Admiralty had almost no direct evidence of what had occurred. What they possessed instead were fragments, occasional reports from search expeditions, scattered relics recovered from Arctic shores, and testimonies gathered from Inuit communities who had encountered starving European travelers in the region. But the most important written source, the Victory Point note, contained only a few lines of information. It confirmed that the ships had become trapped in ice and that Franklin had died in June 1847. But it did not describe the final journey south, the conditions aboard the ships, or the fate of the last survivors. In other words, the most famous Arctic mystery of the 19th century rested on a document barely longer than a paragraph. Something similar appears in the case of the Mary Celeste. The official inquiry held in Gibraltar examined the ship carefully. Investigators studied the cargo, inspected the hull, and questioned the crew of the Dei Gratia, who had discovered the vessel. The records of the hearing show a long effort to identify signs of violence, mutiny, or insurance fraud. No, but the evidence simply did not support any clear narrative. The ship was seaworthy, the cargo was intact, the personal belongings of the crew remained aboard. The logbook ended days before the ship was discovered. What investigators ultimately produced was not a definitive explanation, but a collection of competing possibilities. The same pattern appears in the Flannan Isles disappearance. The official report from the Northern Lighthouse Board concluded that the keepers had most likely been swept away by an unexpected wave while attempting to secure equipment during a storm. Yet even this explanation relied on inference rather than direct evidence. No bodies were recovered, no eyewitness accounts survived. But the lighthouse logs themselves offered little insight into the final moments before the men vanished. In many ways, the documentary record of the event consists mainly of what investigators believed was most plausible, not what they could conclusively prove. Even the story of Louis Leprince reflects this problem. Records confirm that he boarded a train in Dijon in September 1890. Records also confirm that he never arrived in Paris. But beyond those 2 points, the documentary trail becomes surprisingly thin. Police investigations left behind only partial reports. Later, family correspondence introduced new possibilities, but without definitive conclusions. The absence of clear documentation leaves historians with a puzzle that can be approached, but never completely solved. And when we compare these cases side by side, something interesting emerges. The mysteries themselves are different, but the structure of the surviving evidence often looks remarkably similar. A brief document, an incomplete report, a witness statement recorded years after the event, fragments of testimony gathered by later investigators. What is missing from the historical record is not curiosity, it is closure. The 19th century left behind enormous quantities of written material, newspapers, official correspondence, personal letters, scientific reports. Yet in certain cases, the surviving evidence forms something more like an outline than a full story. The documents provide glimpses of what happened, but they rarely allow historians to reconstruct the entire sequence of events, which leads us to a deeper question. If the 19th century produced both an explosion of documentation and a surprising number of unresolved mysteries, what does that say about the nature of history itself? By the end of this journey, the question has quietly shifted. At the beginning of the story, the mystery seemed simple. What happened to the Franklin expedition? But as we followed the fragments, the drifting Mary Celeste, the silent lighthouse of the Flannan Isles, the vanished inventor Louis Le Prince, the strange architecture of the Winchester House, the altered skies after Krakatoa, and the unsettling experience at Trianon. The investigation began to point somewhere else. The mystery was no longer just about one expedition. It was about a century. The 19th century is often remembered as the beginning of the modern world. It was the era that built railways across continents and telegraph cables across oceans. Scientific institutions grew stronger. Governments developed vast archives. Newspapers circulated information at unprecedented speeds. For many people living at the time, the world seemed to be becoming clearer and more understandable. Exploration was mapping unknown regions. Science was explaining natural phenomena. Technology was connecting distant societies. But the stories we have explored suggest something more complicated. Progress did not eliminate uncertainty. In some ways, it changed the form that uncertainty took. Earlier centuries had their own mysteries, lost cities, uncharted lands, legends passed down through oral tradition. The 19th century introduced a different kind of puzzle. Mysteries that appeared inside systems designed to eliminate them. A carefully planned expedition vanishes despite modern navigation and supplies. A commercial ship crosses well-traveled shipping lanes, yet loses its crew. A lighthouse, built to protect sailors, becomes the center of a disappearance. A technological pioneer disappears at the edge of a new invention. A house becomes a physical structure wrapped in myth and speculation. A volcanic eruption changes the atmosphere of the entire planet. And two educated observers believe they briefly stepped into the past. None of these events necessarily share a single explanation. Some can be understood through natural forces, others through human error, misinterpretation, or incomplete records. But taken together, they reveal something about the nature of the modern world as it first emerged. Modern systems expanded rapidly during the 19th century, but understanding did not always expand at the same speed. Maps grew larger, archives grew thicker, technology grew more powerful. Yet there were still places, geographical, social, psychological, where the systems of modernity struggled to fully capture reality. These places became the blind spots of modern history, and sometimes those blind spots produced stories that continue to feel strange long after the events themselves have passed. Which brings us to one final reflection. If the 19th century created the modern world, did it also create the modern kind of mystery? Perhaps the most interesting thing about these stories is not that they remain mysterious. History is full of unsolved events. What makes these particular cases unusual is where they occurred. They did not happen in forgotten civilizations or ancient myths. They happened in the modern world as it was being built. An empire at the height of its power lost an expedition in the Arctic. A functioning ship crossed the Atlantic with no one left aboard. A lighthouse designed to guide sailors went dark. A man who helped invent motion pictures disappeared before history could fully record his role. A house became a maze of architecture and legend. An eruption on a distant island changed the color of skies around the world. And two visitors to Versailles believed, if only for a moment, that the past had returned. Each story leaves us with fragments, evidence, documents, witness accounts, but never quite enough to close the narrative completely. And maybe that is the quiet lesson hidden inside these 19th century mysteries. The modern world promised clarity. But even as maps expanded, archives grew, and technology advanced, there were still places where certainty slipped away. And perhaps the most enduring mystery is not what happened in these individual stories, but why an age so determined to understand the world kept discovering how much remained just beyond its reach.